The Chicken Boy by Steven Johnson. Chapter 1. The Chicken Farm. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the farm in golden light. The barn stood quiet, filled with the earthy smell of hay and the soft clucking of chickens. James, a 10-year-old boy with messy brown hair and curious eyes, wandered inside. He loved the farm, but most of all, he loved the chicks. Their tiny bodies and soft peeps fascinated him. A group of chicks huddled in the corner, pecking at the ground. James crouched down and crept closer, his hands twitching with excitement. The chicks scattered, their tiny feet pattering against the dirt floor. All but one. It stayed still, its black eyes watching him. James reached out and picked it up. It was so small, so fragile, its heart beating rapidly in his hands. He held it close, feeling its warmth and the softness of its feathers. For a moment he just stood there, his breath uneven. Then, almost without thinking, his grip tightened. The chick let out a faint peep, its legs kicking weakly. James didn't stop. He squeezed harder until he felt a soft crunch. The chick went still. James looked down at the lifeless chick in his hands. He didn't feel remorse. Instead, a strange, electric feeling rushed through him. He dropped the chick and walked out of the barn. Outside, the sun was setting, casting the farm in shades of orange and pink. The air was calm, but something felt different. James wandered toward the house, his mind buzzing with the memory of what he had done. He didn't understand why he had done it, but he knew he wanted to feel it again. His mother stood on the porch, her tired eyes watching him. "James," she called softly. "Supper's ready." He looked at her, hesitated, then nodded and followed her inside. The farm was quiet, but something had shifted. Something dark had taken root, and it would only grow from here. Chapter 2. Supper time. The kitchen was dim, the flickering fluorescent light casting uneven shadows across the worn wooden table. A plate of fried chicken and boiled potatoes sat untouched, the steam long gone. James sat stiffly in his chair, his small hands gripping the edge of the table. His father, Willie, loomed at the head of the table, a half-empty beer bottle clenched in his calloused hand. His face was flushed, his eyes sharp and angry. "James," Willie said, his voice low and rough, "why didn't you finish your chores?" James kept his eyes down, staring at his plate. I was in the barn," he stammered. "I lost track of time." Willie's jaw tightened. "Lost track of time?" he repeated, his voice rising. "You think that's a good excuse?" He slammed his fist on the table, making the plates rattle. James flinched, his heart pounding. Willie stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're useless," he spat, his voice thick with anger. He hurled his beer bottle against the wall. It shattered, glass scattering across the floor. "Clean it up," Willie barked, his face red. James jumped up, his hands trembling as he grabbed the broom. He started sweeping, tears streaming down his face. The glass crunched under the broom, each sound making him flinch. Willie watched him for a moment, then grabbed his belt from the back of the chair. He stepped behind James, the leather strap dangling in his hand. "No, please," James begged, his voice breaking. The belt came down hard, striking James back. He cried out, the pain sharp and burning. Willie hit him again and again, each blow harder than the last. James screamed, begging for it to stop, but Willie didn't listen. James' mother sat frozen at the table, her face pale. She clutched her napkin, her eyes fixed on her plate. She didn't move or speak, her fear holding her in place. Finally, Willie stopped. He threw the belt on the table, his chest heaving. "Get up," he said coldly. "Don't forget your chores again." James nodded weakly, his body trembling. He dragged himself to his feet, every movement painful, and stumbled out of the kitchen. He went to his room and collapsed on the bed, his back throbbing, and his mind a blur of fear and confusion. Outside, Willie opened another beer, the sound of the cap hitting the table echoing through the house. James lay in the dark, his tears soaking into the pillow. The farm, once a safe place, now felt like a trap. Something inside him felt broken, and he didn't know how to fix it. Chapter 3. The Last Night at the Farm. James was shaken awake in the middle of the night. His mother's face loomed over him, her eyes wide and frantic. "James, get up," she whispered, her voice trembling but urgent. "Hurry." Still groggy, James sat up, his heart pounding. His mother didn't give him time to think. She pulled him out of bed, her grip tight on his arm, and rushed him down the hallway. The house was dark and silent, except for the sound of their hurried footsteps. James stumbled as she dragged him toward the front door, his bare feet cold against the wooden floor. Outside, the night air was cool and damp. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the farm. James shivered as his mother led him into the front yard. She stopped suddenly and turned to him, her face pale and streaked with tears. "James," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I had to do it. I had to." James stared at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice small and shaky. Before she could answer, the sound of tires on gravel cut through the quiet night. James turned to see red and blue lights flashing down the long driveway. A police car pulled up, followed by an unmarked sedan. The lights were blinding, and James squinted, his heart racing. Two officers stepped out of the car, their faces stern. They walked straight toward James' mother, their movements quick and deliberate. "Ma'am," one of them said, his voice firm. James' mother didn't resist. She held out her hands, her face calm but sad. The officers handcuffed her and began reading her rights. James stood frozen, his mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. As the officers led his mother toward the car, a woman stepped out of the unmarked sedan. She wasn't in uniform, but she carried herself with authority. She approached James, her expression soft but serious. "James," she said gently, "my name is Ms. Carter. I'm here to help you. You need to come with me." James looked at her, then back at his mother, who was now being placed in the back of the police car. "Where's my dad?" he asked, his voice trembling. Ms. Carter hesitated, then knelt down to his level. "We'll talk about everything soon," she said. "But right now you need to come with me." James didn't understand. He didn't know why his mother was being taken away or why this woman was here. He didn't know that his mother, tired of years of abuse, had shot and killed his father, Willie, while he lay passed out drunk on the couch. He didn't know that his life was changed forever. As Ms. Carter led him to the car, James glanced back at the farmhouse one last time. The red and blue lights reflected off the windows. He climbed into the car, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The farm faded into the distance as they drove away, and James sat in silence, staring out the window. He didn't know what was coming next. Chapter 4. 10 years later. James sat in the back of the city bus, his hood pulled low over his face. His clothes were dirty and frayed, his hands rough and stained. At 20 years old, he looked far older, his face gaunt and shadowed by years of hardship. The bus rattled through the city, its fluorescent lights flickering weakly. James glanced around, his eyes landing on a young woman a few seats away. She was scrolling through her phone, her headphones in, oblivious to him. He leaned over, flashing a crooked smile. "Hey," he said, his voice rough. "You come here often?" The woman looked up, her nose wrinkling in disgust as she took in his appearance. "Not in a million years," she snapped, turning away. James' smile twisted into a sneer. "Whatever, whore," he muttered under his breath. He yanked the bus string, the bell dinging loudly. At the next stop, he shuffled off the bus, his sneakers scuffing against the pavement. The street was littered with trash. James crouched down, scanning the ground for cigarette butts. He spotted a few near the curb and picked them up, brushing off the dirt before lighting one with a cheap lighter. He took a long drag, the smoke burning his lungs, but he didn't care. It was something As he stood there, a voice called out, "James, over here." James turned to see Charles walking toward him. Charles was taller than James, with a lean build and a face that had seen just as much hardship. His clothes were just as worn, but there was a glint in his eye that James recognized, a glint that meant trouble. "What's up, man?" Charles said, clapping James on the shoulder. "You look like hell." "Feel like it too," James replied, flicking the cigarette butt to the ground. "What's going on?" Charles grinned. His teeth yellowed, but his smile wide. "I got something to show you. Come on." The two of them walked toward the local city park, a place where the homeless gathered. The park was overgrown, the bushes thick and unkempt. Charles led James to a secluded spot, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "Check this out," Charles said, crouching down and reaching deep into the bushes. He pulled out a sleek, black pistol, a Kimber 1911. The gun gleamed in the dim light, its polished finish and intricate details marking it as something far beyond what someone like Charles could afford. James' eyes widened. "Where the hell did you get that?" he asked, his voice low. Charles smirked, holding the gun carefully in his hands. "I'll show you," he said. "But first you gotta promise me something." "What?" James asked, his heart racing. Charles leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You gotta be ready for whatever comes next. This ain't just a gun, James. This is a ticket to something bigger. You in?" James stared at the pistol. He didn't know what Charles was planning, but he knew one thing. He had nothing left to lose. "I'm in," he said, his voice steady. Charles grinned, slapping James on the back. "Good. Let's go." The two of them walked deeper into the park, the Kimber 1911 hidden under Charles's jacket. James didn't know what was coming, but he could feel it, something dark, something dangerous. Chapter 5. The Big Job. James and Charles walked through the park, their footsteps crunching on the dirt path that led into the tree line. They knew the park like the back of their hands, every twist and turn etched into their memories. About 2 minutes into the woods, they reached a hidden campsite, cleverly concealed by bushes and camouflage tarps arranged in a full circle. Inside the makeshift hideout were 2 pop-up tents, a small barbecue pit in the center, and scattered bags of shoplifted goods, women's clothes, stolen car speakers, and piles of trash. James looked around, his eyes narrowing as he turned to Charles. "Where'd you really get that pistol?" he asked, his voice low and skeptical. Charles smirked, leaning against one of the tents. "I told you, man. I found it." James crossed his arms. "Found it where?" Charles shrugged, his grin widening. Okay. I broke into this old man's garage this morning. Thought I'd find some easy cash, you know? But instead, I found a whole shooting setup. Gun cleaning supplies, targets, empty gun boxes, bullet reloading stuff, you name it. And there it was, just sitting on the bench like a gift. A Kimber 1911, right out in the open. James raised an eyebrow. "All that gun stuff, and you only found one gun?" Charles nodded, his expression turning serious. "I checked every box in that garage, man. They were all empty. But get this, I'm betting the old man's got the rest of his collection inside the house. He's got a..." This was just the one he left out. James frowned. "So what? You're saying we should rob him?" Charles stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Exactly. Think about it, James. This guy's got a gold mine in there. Guns like these? We could sell make enough to get out of this dump. No more sleeping in parks, no more eating trash. This is our ticket out." James hesitated, glancing around the campsite. "What about the old man? You think he's just gonna let us walk in and take his stuff?" Charles laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Come on, man. He's old. And weak. We can handle him. And even if he puts up a fight, we've got this." He patted the Kimber 1911 tucked into his waistband. "It's easy money, James. We just gotta be smart about it." James stared at Charles, his stomach churning with a mix of fear and excitement. He thought about the life he'd been living, scraping by, stealing, surviving day to day. This could change everything. But it could also go wrong in so many ways. "What's the plan?" James asked finally, his voice quiet. Charles grinned, clapping James on the shoulder. "That's what I like to hear. Here's what we're going to do." As Charles laid out the details, James listened. The plan was risky, but Charles was right. It could solve all their money problems. Chapter 6. Ms. Carter. Ms. Carter sat at a small table in the corner of a local diner, picking at a salad, while the hum of conversation buzzed around her. Across from her sat two police officers, their uniforms crisp and their expressions serious. They were discussing the upcoming operation to clear out the homeless population from the city park. It had been 10 years since she'd first met James on that cold, chaotic night at the chicken farm. 10 years since she'd taken him away from the only life he'd ever known. She hadn't seen him since he aged out of the system, but he still crossed her mind from time to time. She wondered where he was, what he was doing, and if he was okay. She had always hoped he'd find his way. But the world wasn't kind to kids like James. At 40 years old, Ms. Carter had spent nearly half her life in social services. Her dedication to helping others had kept her youthful, both in appearance and spirit. She had no wrinkles, no gray hairs, and her energy was boundless. She loved her job, even on the hardest days, because she believed in what she was doing. But today was different. Today, she wasn't just offering help. She was part of a plan to force people out of the only shelter they had. "We'll start at dawn," one of the officers said, tapping the table with his finger for emphasis. "We'll give them a chance to leave peacefully, but if they resist, we'll have to remove them by force. The park's got to be cleared by tonight." Ms. Carter nodded, though her stomach churned. She had always been there to offer resources, to connect people with shelters, job programs, and counseling. But this felt wrong. She wasn't here to force anyone. She was here to help. Yet, the police had made it clear. The park was being cleared, one way or another. "I'll be there to offer assistance," she said, her voice calm but firm. "If anyone wants help, I'll make sure they get it. But I'm not here to strong-arm anyone." The officers exchanged a glance, but didn't argue. They knew Ms. Carter's reputation. She was respected. As the meeting wrapped up, Ms. Carter gathered her things and stepped outside. The sun was shining, but the weight of what was coming hung over her. She thought about the people in the park who had fallen through the cracks and were just trying to survive. She thought about the belongings they'd lose, the little pieces of their lives that would be thrown away and destroyed. It didn't sit right with her, but she also knew she couldn't stop it. All she could do was be there, ready to help those who wanted it. And maybe, just maybe, she'd find a way to make a difference, even in the face of something so harsh. Chapter 7. The old man wasn't home. James and Charles crouched behind a row of overgrown bushes, staring at the old man's house. It was a modest, weathered home with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The plan was simple. Charles would pose as a delivery driver, knock on the front door, and distract the old man. James would then rush in from the side, and together they'd force their way inside, tie him up, and take everything they could carry. They'd even planned to steal the old man's pickup truck parked in the driveway. Easy money. But as they approached the house, they noticed something unusual. The place was silent. No lights were on, no movement inside. Charles smirked. "Look," he whispered, "he's not even home. This job just got a whole lot easier." James nodded, though a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. They crept around to the back of the house, where a small, unlocked window provided easy access. Charles boosted James up, and soon they were both inside, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The house was cluttered but clean, with the faint smell of mothballs and old wood. They moved quickly, searching drawers and cabinets. They found a stash of old guns, hunting rifles, shotguns, and revolvers, along with jewelry, cash, and other valuables. Charles set down the loaded Kimber 1911 on a nearby table to free his hands as he rifled through a dresser. That's when they heard it, a soft creak of floorboards. James froze, his heart pounding. Slowly, an elderly woman stepped into the room. She was frail, her silver hair pulled back into a bun, but her eyes were sharp. She spotted the Kimber 1911 on the table, picked it up, and cocked it with surprising ease. "Wrong house, you dirtbag," she said, her voice steady but laced with anger. Charles's blood ran cold. He hadn't seen her coming. He glanced at James, who was frozen in place, his eyes wide with panic. The woman didn't notice James in the other room, her focus entirely on Charles. James moved quickly, his instincts taking over. He crept up behind the woman and struck the back of her head with all his might. She crumpled to the floor, the Kimber 1911 slipping from her hands. For a moment, there was silence. Then she began to scream. "Shut up," James hissed, his voice trembling. "Stop screaming." But the woman didn't stop. Her screams grew louder, piercing, and desperate. James panicked. He didn't want to hurt her, but he couldn't let her keep screaming. He grabbed her by the throat, his hands shaking as he tried to silence her. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Just stop." But she didn't. Her screams turned to gurgles as James tightened his grip. He didn't want to do this. He didn't want any of this. But it was too late. When it was over, James and Charles stood in stunned silence, staring at the lifeless woman on the floor. Neither of them had wanted this. They had just wanted easy money, a way out of their miserable lives. But now, they were in deeper than they'd ever imagined. "We gotta get out of here," Charles said, his voice barely above a whisper. James nodded numbly. They grabbed the Kimber 1911 and a few other items, then set the house on fire, hoping to destroy the evidence. The flames spread quickly, engulfing the old home as they fled. Back at their secret campground in the city park, they sat in silence, the weight of what they'd done pressing down on them. "Oh my God, what have I done?" James asks himself. Chapter 8. The Chicken Dream. The night was cold and silent, and felt heavy, like it was pressing down on James and Charles as they sat in their hidden campsite. The fire had been left unlit, the darkness wrapping around them like a shroud. Neither of them had slept much since the incident at the old man's house. The weight of what they'd done, what James had done, hung between them, unspoken but suffocating. Charles, oddly enough, seemed less affected. He cracked stupid jokes, laughed at nothing, and acted like the whole thing was just another misadventure. "Relax, man," he said at one point, tossing a pebble into the darkness. "It's not like you meant to do it." She was old anyway. Probably didn't have much time left. James didn't respond. He just stared at the ground, his hands clenched into fists. He couldn't shake the image of the old woman's face, her wide, terrified eyes as he'd choked the life out of her. And now they were stuck with stolen jewelry and credit cards they couldn't sell, evidence of a crime they couldn't undo. When James finally fell asleep, his dreams were a chaotic swirl of guilt and fear. He saw the old woman again, her face twisted in anger as she pointed the Kimber 1911 at Charles. Then the dream shifted, and he was back on the chicken farm, a child again, holding the tiny chick in his hands. He felt its fragile body, its rapid heartbeat, and then the sickening crunch as he squeezed too hard. The chick's lifeless body fell to the ground, and James felt a wave of nausea. The dream changed again. This time, James was a small child, cowering on the floor as a gigantic chicken loomed over him. The chicken held a leather belt in its talons, swinging it down again and again. James screamed, I'm sorry, but the chicken didn't stop. The blows kept coming, each one harder than the last, until James woke up gasping for air. He sat up, his body drenched in sweat despite the freezing night. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands trembled as he looked over at Charles, who was snoring softly a few feet away. The dream lingered in his mind, the fear and guilt twisting into something darker, something desperate. James reached for the Kimber 1911, his fingers curling around the cold metal. He stared at Charles, his best friend, his brother, the only person left in the world who felt like family. But Charles was also the only person who knew what James had done. The only person who could tie him to the murder and the fire. James' mind raced. He thought about his mother, how she'd killed his father in his sleep to escape the abuse. He thought about how she'd said, "I had to do it." Maybe this was the same. Maybe he had to do it too. His hands tightened around the gun as he crept closer to Charles. His breath came in shallow gasps, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it would wake Charles up. But Charles didn't stir. He just lay there, peaceful and unaware. James raised the Kimber 1911, his finger hovering over the trigger. For a moment, he hesitated. He pulls the trigger. The shot echoed through the campsite, shattering the silence. Charles's body jerked once, then went still. He stared at Charles, waiting for him to move, to laugh, to say it was all a joke. But Charles didn't move. He was gone. James dropped the gun and stumbled back, his legs giving out as he collapsed to the ground. He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with sobs. He had done it. He had killed Charles. He had killed the only person left who cared about him. The night was silent again. James sat there in the darkness, alone, the cold seeping into his bones. He had wanted to escape his past, but now it felt like it was all he had left. Chapter 9. Better Late Than Never. The morning sun filtered through the trees as police cars and city vehicles lined the parking lot of the city park. Officers in uniform and workers in bright orange vests milled about, preparing for the homeless sweep that had been delayed by a day. One officer chuckled to another. "I thought we were doing this yesterday." His partner smirked and replied, "Better late than never," his tone dripping with dark humor. Ms. Carter arrived in her own car, separate from the police and city workers. She stepped out, smoothing her blazer and adjusting the folder of resources she carried. At 40, she looked almost the same as she had a decade ago, but today felt different. This wasn't about offering help. It was about clearing the park, and she wasn't sure how she felt about that. As she walked toward the gathering crowd of officers, a homeless man emerged from a trail in the tree line. He moved quickly, but not so fast as to draw attention. His clothes were ragged, his face gaunt and weathered. Miss Carter glanced at him as he passed, but she didn't recognize him at first. It wasn't until their eyes met that she froze. The man stopped for a moment, his gaze locking with hers. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice rough and trembling. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want to do it." Then he walked past her, his pace quickening as he crossed the street and broke into a full sprint, disappearing around the corner. Ms. Carter stood there stunned. It took her a moment to process what had just happened. The man's face, his voice, it all clicked into place. James. It was James. The boy she'd taken from the chicken farm all those years ago. The boy she'd thought about so often, wondering where life had taken him. But he wasn't a boy anymore. The streets had aged him, hardened him. He was almost unrecognizable. Her heart ached as she replayed his words in her mind. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want to do it." What had he done? What had he been forced into? Before she could dwell on it further, the police began their sweep. They moved through the park methodically, clearing out tents, belongings, and people. Ms. Carter followed behind, offering resources and assistance. But her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the image of James' face, the pain in his eyes. A few hours later, the discovery was made. Hidden deep in the woods, the police found the secret campsite. Among the scattered trash and stolen goods, they found the body of a young man, Charles. The officers quickly identified him as a known homeless individual and began questioning others in the park about his death. When Ms. Carter heard the news, her stomach dropped. She thought back to James' words, his desperate apology. It all made sense now. James must have been involved in Charles's death. She didn't know the details, but she knew enough to piece it together. James had killed his best friend, his brother. And now he was on the run. As the police began their search for James, Miss Carter stood quietly, her heart heavy. She had dedicated her life to helping people like James, to giving them a chance at a better life. But now, she wondered if she had failed him. The park was cleared, the campsite destroyed, and the body of Charles was taken away. But for Ms. Carter, the day was far from over. She couldn't stop thinking about James, about the boy he had been, and the man he had become. Chapter 10. The Chicken Farm Road. 10 years had transformed the old dirt road leading to the chicken farm. What was once a lonely, dusty path winding through open fields was now a paved street lined with rows of new houses, their manicured lawns and identical facades stretching as far as the eye could see. The farm itself was an anomaly now, a stubborn relic of the past sitting awkwardly on a small, irregular plot of land. The barn and farmhouse stood like ghosts, surrounded by the encroaching development. It was only a matter of time before a bulldozer would erase them forever. Miss Carter drove slowly down the road, her hands tight on the steering wheel. Beside her sat a young police officer, his uniform crisp and his demeanor eager. She had convinced him to come with her, trusting her intuition that James might have returned to the place where it all began. The farm was the only connection he had left to his past, and she had a sinking feeling he might be there. As they pulled up to the property, the fields where James had once chased chicks were gone, replaced by neatly fenced yards and swing sets. Only the farmhouse and barn remained, their weathered wood and sagging roofs a stark contrast to the shiny new homes surrounding them. "I'll check the barn," Miss Carter said, stepping out of the car. "You take the farmhouse." The young officer nodded, his hand resting on his holstered gun as he approached the house. Miss Carter walked toward the barn, her footsteps crunching on the gravel. The doors creaked as she pushed them open, the dim light filtering through cracks in the walls. The air was thick with the smell of dust. "James," she called softly, her voice echoing in the empty space. "It's me, Ms. Carter." There was no answer, but she could feel his presence. She moved deeper into the barn, her eyes scanning the shadows. Then she saw him, huddled behind a rusted workbench, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow. In his hand was a gun, its barrel pressed against his temple. "James," she said, her voice steady but filled with compassion. "Put the gun down. Let's talk." James looked at her, his hand trembling. "I'm ready to die," he whispered. "I can't do this anymore." Miss Carter took a cautious step closer. "You don't have to do this, James. Whatever's happened, we can figure it out. Just talk to me." Tears streamed down James' face as he began to confess. He told her about the elderly woman, how he hadn't meant to kill her, but couldn't stop himself. He told her about Charles, his best friend, his brother, and how he'd shot him in a moment of panic and desperation. And finally, he told her about the chick, the helpless little creature he'd crushed all those years ago, the first spark of darkness that had grown into the storm consuming him now. Ms. Carter listened, her heart breaking with every word. She wanted to reach out to him, to tell him it wasn't too late, but before she could, the barn door burst open. The young police officer stood in the doorway, his gun drawn. "Drop the weapon," he shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. James froze, his eyes wide with fear. Instinct took over, and he swung the gun toward the officer, firing wildly. The officer returned fire, the sound of gunshots echoing through the barn. James Kimber 1911 clicked empty after 6 shots, and he dropped it, raising his hands in surrender. "I give up," he screamed, his voice cracking. "I give up." The officer rushed forward, tackling James to the ground and cuffing him. Ms. Carter stood frozen, her mind racing. The officer hadn't heard James' confession. He didn't know the full story. Only she did. As James was led away, his head hung low, Miss Carter felt a wave of sadness and guilt. She had tried to help him all those years ago, but the world had been too cruel, too unforgiving. Now, as she watched him being loaded into the back of a police car, she wondered if there was anything she could have done differently. The barn stood silent, its walls bearing witness to the end of James' story. Ms. Carter turned away, her heart heavy, as she walked back to her car. The farm would soon be gone, replaced by another cookie-cutter house, but the memories and the pain would linger long after the bulldozers had done their work. Chapter 11. It's Only Hearsay. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. James sat at the defense table, his face calm and composed, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling around him. Over the past year, he had meticulously crafted a narrative, one that painted him as a victim of circumstance, a man wrongfully accused. And now, as the judge prepared to deliver his ruling, it seemed that narrative had worked. The prosecution had struggled to build a case against James. There was no physical evidence tying him to the murder of the elderly woman or the death of Charles. The only testimony linking James to the crimes came from Miss Carter, who had recounted his confession in the barn. But James' defense attorney had been quick to dismiss her account as hearsay, arguing that it was unreliable. "Your Honor," the defense attorney said, standing confidently before the judge, "there is no concrete evidence to support the charges against my client. The prosecution's case is built entirely on speculation and hearsay. We move to dismiss." The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. He glanced at the prosecution, who looked visibly frustrated, then at James, who sat with his hands folded, his face a mask of innocence. Finally, the judge spoke. "After careful consideration of the evidence presented, I find that the prosecution has failed to meet the burden of proof required to proceed with this case. The charges against Mr. James are hereby dismissed." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. James' attorney smiled, patting his client on the back. James himself remained stoic, but there was a glint of triumph in his eyes. He was free. Ms. Carter sat in the back of the courtroom, her hands clenched in her lap. She had known this might happen, but hearing the judge's words still felt like a punch to the gut. She had told the truth, but it hadn't been enough. James had manipulated the system, weaving a story so convincing that even the jury had believed him. And now he was walking away not just from the courtroom, but from the lives he had destroyed. As James stood and turned to leave, his eyes met Miss Carter's. For a moment, they held each other's gaze. There was no remorse in his expression, no gratitude, no acknowledgement of the bond they had once shared. There was only cold indifference. Ms. Carter felt a chill run down her spine. She had spent her life helping people, believing in the power of compassion and second chances. But now, as she watched James walk out of the courtroom a free man, she felt a fear she hadn't known in years. She knew the truth. She knew what he was capable of. And with James free on the streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. The courtroom emptied, the buzz of conversation fading as people filed out. Ms. Carter remained in her seat. She had always believed in justice, in doing the right thing. But today, justice had failed. James had gotten away with murder, and there was nothing she could do to stop him. As she finally stood to leave, she felt a heavy weight settle on her shoulders. The world outside the courthouse seemed darker now, more dangerous. James was out there, free to do whatever he wanted. And Ms. Carter couldn't help but wonder who his next victim would be. Chapter 12. We Need to Talk. Ms. Carter stepped out of the office building, the weight of the day pressing heavily on her shoulders. The sun had already set, and the parking lot was bathed in the dim glow of flickering streetlights. She fished her keys out of her purse, her mind still replaying the events of the past 2 weeks, James' acquittal, the fear that had settled in her chest, and the nagging feeling that this wasn't over. As she approached her car, something caught her eye. A piece of paper was tucked under her windshield wiper. Her stomach dropped as she reached for it, her fingers trembling slightly. Unfolding the note, she saw 3 words scrawled in messy handwriting. "We need to talk." Her heart raced. She knew instantly who it was from. James. But why? He was free. The case was closed. What could he possibly want from her? She glanced around the parking lot, her breath quickening. That's when she saw him. James stood on the other side of her car, his hands in his pockets, his eyes locked on hers. He looked different, cleaner, more put together. But there was something in his expression that sent a chill down her spine. "Ms. Carter," he called, his voice calm but carrying an edge she couldn't quite place. Panic surged through her. Without thinking, she yanked open her car door, slid inside, and slammed it shut. Her hands fumbled with the keys as she tried to start the engine, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear herself think. James didn't move. He just stood there watching her, as if he knew she couldn't stay. The engine roared to life, and Miss Carter peeled out of the parking lot, her tires screeching against the asphalt. She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see James chasing after her. But he was still standing there, a shadowy figure under the streetlights. Her mind raced as she drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Why was he there? What did he want? She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. James had sought her out, and that could only mean trouble. She needed help. Someone she could trust. Someone who knew the truth about James. She grabbed her phone and scrolled through her contacts, her hands still shaking. When she found the number she was looking for, she hit call. The young police officer who had accompanied her to the farmhouse a year ago answered on the second ring. "Officer Daniels," he said, his voice professional but friendly. "It's Ms. Carter," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need your help." "James, he was just here. He left a note on my car. I think he's following me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Where are you now?" Officer Daniels asked, his tone serious. "I'm driving," she said, glancing in the rearview mirror again. "But I don't feel safe going home. Can I stay with you tonight?" Another pause, shorter this time. "Of course," he said. "I'll text you my address. Just get here safely, okay?" Miss Carter let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As she followed the directions to Officer Daniels' house, her mind kept circling back to James. What did he want? Why now? She had thought it was over, but now she wasn't so sure. James was free, but he wasn't done. And Miss Carter couldn't shake the feeling that whatever came next would be worse than anything she could imagine. Chapter 13. Backstabber. The night was long and restless. Miss Carter lay in the guest bedroom of Officer Daniels' house, her mind racing despite her exhaustion. She had tried to sleep, but every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, made her jump. James was out there somewhere, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't done with her. Officer Daniels had been kind, offering her a place to stay and assuring her that she was safe. But even his calm demeanor couldn't fully ease her nerves. She had finally drifted off in the early hours of the morning, her body giving in to fatigue. Outside, James waited. He had followed Miss Carter to the house, watching from the shadows as she went inside. He had spent the night crouched beneath a window, his patience unwavering. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to let her slip away now. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, James made his move. He slipped through the back door, which had been left unlocked, and moved silently through the house. He found Officer Daniels in the kitchen, leaning over the fridge, his back turned. James didn't hesitate. He pulled a knife from his pocket and plunged it into the officer's back. Officer Daniels gasped, his body stiffening before he crumpled to the floor. James stepped over him, his face calm, almost emotionless. He wiped the blade on his sleeve and moved toward the guest bedroom. Miss Carter stirred as the door creaked open. Her eyes fluttered, then snapped wide as she saw James standing in the doorway, the knife glinting in his hand. She sat up, her heart pounding, her breath caught in her throat. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this? You were found not guilty. It's over. What do you want from me?" James stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You know too much," he said quietly. Ms. Carter shook her head, confused. They threw out my testimony. No one believes me. It doesn't matter what I know. James tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. This isn't about the old woman, he said. And it's not about Charles. Ms. Carter stared at him, her mind racing. Then what? What is this about? James took another step forward, the knife still in his hand. You're the only one who knows, he said, his voice low and steady. The only one who knows I killed that chick in the barn 10 years ago. Ms. Carter's breath hitched. She had almost forgotten about that night, about the confession James had made in the barn. It had seemed so small compared to everything else that had happened since. But now, as she looked into James' cold, empty eyes, she realized how wrong she had been. James, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That was so long ago. It doesn't matter anymore. James shook his head. It matters to me, he said. You're the only one left who knows. And I can't have that. Ms. Carter's mind raced, searching for a way out, for something to say that might stop him. But before she could speak, James raised a knife. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. For James, this wasn't about the murders he had committed or the lives he had destroyed. It was about the one secret he had carried for 10 years, the one secret Ms. Carter had never forgotten. And now, he was determined to make sure no one else would ever know. Chapter 14. The Chicken Dreams. James stood over Ms. Carter, the knife trembling in his hand. His face was pale, his eyes wild and unfocused. The dreams, he muttered, his voice cracking. Every night. The chicken. It beats me. Over and over. I can't sleep. I can't think. I can't escape it. Ms. Carter stared at him, her heart pounding. She had always known James was troubled, but this was something else. He wasn't just a killer. He was broken, his mind shattered by guilt and fear. The chicken nightmares he described weren't just dreams. They were his conscience, his punishment, haunting him relentlessly. James, she said softly, trying to keep her voice calm. This isn't the way. Killing me won't stop the dreams. It won't fix anything. James shook his head violently, his grip tightening on the knife. You don't understand, he shouted, his voice rising. The chicken gods, they won't leave me alone. They know what I did. They know about the chick. They know about everything. If I kill you, if I silence you, maybe they'll stop. Maybe they'll finally let me sleep. Ms. Carter's mind raced. She could see it now. The years of trauma, the abuse, the guilt, all twisting together into something monstrous. James wasn't just a murderer. He was a victim of his own mind, trapped in a cycle of pain and fear. But she also knew there was no reasoning with him. He was too far gone. Before she could say anything else, a sudden movement caught her eye. Officer Daniels, bloodied but alive, had risen to his feet. In his hand was his police belt, the leather strap dangling like a whip. With a grunt of effort, he swung it, the belt cracking against James' back. James screamed, a high-pitched, terrified sound. He dropped the knife and stumbled forward, his hands clutching at his back as if the belt had burned him. Get away from me, he shrieked, his voice trembling with fear. Leave me alone. Officer Daniels didn't move. He didn't need to. The sight of the belt was enough to send James into a full-blown panic. The hardened killer was gone, replaced by a scared, sobbing child. James backed into the corner of the room, his eyes wide with terror. Please, he begged, tears streaming down his face. Please leave me alone. But the demons in his mind wouldn't let him go. James picked up the knife he had dropped, his hands shaking uncontrollably. I'll make them stop, he muttered, his voice barely audible. I'll make them stop. Before anyone could react, James began cutting himself, the blade slicing into his arms, his chest, his legs. He screamed in agony, but he didn't stop. Leave me alone, he cried over and over, as the blood pooled around him. Ms. Carter and Officer Daniels could only watch in horror as James' cries grew weaker, his movements slower. Finally, he slumped against the wall, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The room fell silent, the only sound the faint drip of blood onto the floor. James was gone. Ms. Carter sank to her knees, her hands covering her face. She had spent her life trying to help people like James, but in the end, she had been powerless to save him. The weight of his death, and the lives he had taken, hung heavy in the air. Officer Daniels dropped the belt, his face pale. I didn't mean to," he stammered, but Ms. Carter shook her head. The two of them sat in silence, the dawn light filtering through the windows. James' body lay in the corner, a tragic end to a tragic life. Ms. Carter looked at the bloodstained floor. She couldn't help but wonder if, in some twisted way, James had found the peace he had been searching for. The end.